Hello, my name is Tony Rayns. I make films and write about films, and one of the things I tried to write about was Mizoguchi. I started a book on him back in 1978 and never managed to finish it, and therefore never managed to publish it, although I do plan to draw on some of those unpublished writings in some of what I have to say in the next hour and a half. This is Mizoguchi's film Ugetsu Monogatari, made in 1953. He had 3 more years to live, and he was 55 when he made this. And the main title stresses, here on the left of the screen, the 2 stories by Ueda Akinari on which the film is centrally based. Now, the next credit up is that for the producer, Nagata Masaichi. He was a long-standing associate of Mizoguchi's. They'd worked together since the mid-30s through a succession of companies. He was a couple of years out of jail. He'd been arraigned as a minor war criminal for his activities in the film industry during the war years. But he was released and he founded Daiei Film Company, for which this was made. It was the last of his major companies, and Mizoguchi rejoined him at Daiei. This is Mizoguchi's first film for the company in order to make this. And in fact, all the rest of Mizoguchi's films were made for Daiei. There was a certain tension between them to which we will return later in this commentary because it has some bearing on some of the creative decisions and some of the arguments behind those creative decisions that affected the way the film turned out. Now, the 2 stories by Ueda came from a collection called Ugetsu Monogatari, published rather resonantly in 1776 in Japan. There were 2 of 9 stories in the book. The title Ugetsu Monogatari actually simply means rain, moon stories. U is rain, Getsu is moon, Monogatari is the rather poetic formal word for a story. The best translation of the book as a whole is by Leon Zolbrod under the title Tales of Moonlight and Rain, but it has also been translated rather more fancifully as Tales of the Pale and Mysterious Moon After the Rain. It isn't quite there in the Japanese, but the crucial thing is that rain and moon are different things, so there's a principle of dialectic is built into these stories from the very outset. Now, the caption that follows Mizoguchi's own credit asserts the continuing relevance and interest of the Ugetsu stories for a modern reader and viewer. Its appearance in the credits at this point, or at the end of the credits, suggests exactly how anomalous or strange it was for Mizoguchi to want to make a film like this at this particular moment in Japanese film history. This caption, the following one, locates the film very precisely, both geographically in a little village called Nakanago on the banks of Lake Biwa, and historically in the late 16th century, a period of incessant civil wars in Japan, which threw much of the country into chaos. I think that the reason Mizoguchi changed the settings of the original stories and opted for a very particular historical moment for his setting in the film is that he was making the film in a period only 6 or 7 years after the end of the Pacific War, in a Japan that was still economically very depressed. The economic miracle was still quite many years away. A lot of people were experiencing continuing hardship, both economically and in terms of their work. And the film was, I think, designed to, in some ways, reflect back on the very recent experience of many ordinary Japanese. He's not the first director in East Asia who has opted to use a historical analogy to illuminate the present. I think that's what he was in many ways doing here. But he was also, of course, asserting some values that he feared had been lost. The point of showing a vivid picture of the Japanese past is in many ways to underline how different it is from what Japan has become in the present. Again, he's not the first director to do that either. Now, in terms of his storytelling, what Mizoguchi is doing is plunging us straight into the middle of an action. There is no ponderous exposition here. We're meeting the 4 central characters, 2 couples, 2 husbands and wives. We're seeing how they react to this exceptional circumstance they find themselves in, that is to say, an impending civil war, and they're reacting accordingly. The film is going to centrally, I think, be about the differences in their reactions, the way that the men react and the way that the women react. Mizoguchi is already doing something a little different from the stylistic practices that made his name back in the 1930s and 1940s. This kind of very straight-ahead storytelling, mostly done in mid-shot with fades to black, fades in from black, the occasional mix to signify passing time usually, This kind of rather simple visual syntax owes a great deal, I would say, to Hollywood cinema and represents Mizoguchi's attempt to get past some of the stylistic tropes that he'd explored rather obsessively in the past and look forward to a more modern type of storytelling. But it's not a storytelling indebted to Hollywood. He, like Ozu in a very different way, rejects many of the conventions of Hollywood storytelling. There's no pattern of reverse angle cuts, for example, which is one of the dominant traits of all Hollywood filmmaking at this period. Now, Mizoguchi became known in the 30s for exploring the sequence shot, where possible shooting an entire scene of a film in one continuous take. He doesn't do that here, but as you can see already, he does have a preference for the more extended shots, which have a certain kind of fluidity. And when he cuts, as there, it's usually a concertina cut for emphasis, cutting to a closer point of view on the same action from the same angle. Sometimes it's a concertina backwards to a wider perspective on the same action. Now, as we'll see later in the film, there are sometimes other kinds of cuts, always for effect, but in general the film proceeds in long, stately and very fluid moving camera takes. Now, in terms of the structure of the film, as we'll see, and it's already been suggested, but it's about to be very heavily underlined, we're cross-cutting between the situations of different protagonists. And we've just seen one central couple, in fact, the central couple, Genjiro and his wife Miyagi and their child Genichi. Now we're seeing Genjiro's younger brother Tobei, who has ambitions way above his station. He's the most humble kind of peasant farmer and, as we will see, a bit of an idiot. But he has uncontrollable ambitions to become a soldier, which is something very far-fetched for somebody of his class background. This strand of the story, incidentally, derives from something that's not acknowledged in the film's credits, but one of the other key sources for the film. Mizoguchi wanted to combine the stories from Ueda Akinari with some ideas he took from Maupassant's stories, which were translated into Japanese in the Meiji period, the late 19th century, and became universally popular in Japan, and were certainly much admired by Mizoguchi himself. In fact, he'd made already one film completely based on Maupassant's story. The source here is a story called Décoré, published in 1883, and it's about a Monsieur Sacrément who is so set on winning the Légion d'honneur that he fails to notice that his wife is having an affair with the official who is going to grant him the honor that he so craves. As you can see, the story doesn't translate directly into Ugetsu, but Mizoguchi and his writers took a certain key inspiration from it. More something to do with male psychology, I guess. Now, Mizoguchi's art director on this film, or production designer, was a man called Ito Kisaku. And those who know anything about late Mizoguchi films know that the regular name on the art director credit is a man called Mizutani Hiroshi, and will may be surprised that he's not present on this occasion. Mizutani was as much part of Mizoguchi's late team as the cinematographer Miyagawa Kazuo, so his absence is kind of anomalous, but the reason for it is a very simple one to explain. They had worked together on the preceding film, The Life of Oharu, and in fact Mizutani had invested some of his own money in the film because it was a very low-budget enterprise and a very ambitious film to make on a low budget. Mizutani had taken exception to the way that Mizoguchi exercised his usual perfectionism in matters of period detail and period dress and choice of props and such like, and felt that Mizoguchi had been recklessly wasteful, and since it was Mizutani's own money that was in question, he took offense at this, and it was in fact 3 more films before Mizutani rejoined the Mizoguchi team and became once again a key and valued collaborator. In the meantime, Mr. Ito took over and I think did a very fine job. But the lesson we can learn, I think, from this anecdote is that it actually made very little difference who was the art director or production designer on any Mizoguchi film, as long as it was somebody who measured up to Mizoguchi's own exacting standards. Now, if we return from that to the question of the film syntax, you'll notice that there was one cut in the middle of this sequence, giving us a different angle on the room. Following motion, Genjiro got up and sat down again on the other side of the room. It's not hard to see why he made the cut. It's because in this new composition, Genjiro is almost framed by racks and racks of his pottery. And the reason that Mizoguchi has reasserted the pottery is because Genjiro is set on profiteering from the war by making and selling more pots. However, Mizoguchi very elegantly uses the new composition, with Ohama entering in the background and being very disconsolate because her husband has not come back, into the return of the errant husband. Again, all of this is integrated into one shot, which explores the space and keeps the action extremely homogeneous and stresses the links that bind all these people together. Incidentally, the actor who plays the rather abject Tobei, his name is Ozawa Sakae, or that's how he's billed here. Mizoguchi fans may recognize him as the treacherous Hayase from the film My Love Has Been Burning, made 4 years earlier, 1949. In the 4 years between the two films, he changed his name, so he's no longer Ozawa Eitaro, but now Ozawa Sakae. Now, this composition, showing Genjiro at work with his wife Miyagi in the background, fending off the imprecations of the child Genichi, is an important one because Mizoguchi wants us to remember it simply because he's going to return to it at a later point in the film, albeit with very significant difference. So it's an image that he wants to implant in our minds at this point and have it resonate through the rest of the film. Here it's used to introduce a whole series of shots demonstrating the mechanics of crafting pots in the late 16th century in Japan. This is an area in which I personally profess absolutely no expertise, but I take it completely on trust that this is a very faithful, almost fanatically accurate representation of what it was like to turn pots on wheels, to glaze them, to fire kilns, to bake the pots in the kilns, to put them on racks to dry, and so on and so on. And the reason that I take this on trust is because Mizoguchi is known to be one of the most fanatically perfectionist filmmakers in such matters of historical detail. Famously, in his film Tale of the Late Chrysanthemums back in 1939, he once kept the entire crew waiting for half a day because a particular small prop that he needed was not available, and he preferred to have everybody wait until it arrived before shooting a frame. Since he was such a perfectionist director, and since he was so obsessive about these matters of historical detail, particularly historical detail, some people found him, well, an intolerable taskmaster. Some people thought that he was the Michael Cimino of his day. Well, now this depiction of what it was like to make and market pots in the 16th century inaugurates a set of sequences showing the arrival of war in this village and the effect on these families. And since I think the sequence of events is pretty self-explanatory, I don't think it requires any particular elucidation from me, I'm going to take the next few minutes to turn away from the narrative as such and just let it barrel along at its own pace, and talk instead about the way that Mizoguchi got to this point in his career. Let me try and attempt a very sketchy account of Mizoguchi's overall development. In the 1920s, Mizoguchi worked for the Nikatsu Company, where his peers included the great theater director Osanai Kaoru, who was the key figure, if you like, in the introduction of what was called Shingeki into Japan. Shingeki meant new theater, and what it essentially meant was the new Western-style theater performed in translation in Japanese. And this began from Ibsen, Chekhov, the key European dramatists, and gradually expanded into original plays written in Japanese for the Japanese theater. Osanai had an important protege called Murata Minoru, who Mizoguchi, we learn from contemporary accounts, saw as his most bitter rival. Mizoguchi, who had not been to university, was determined at all costs, like many autodidacts, to demonstrate that he was the intellectual equal, if not superior to, those who had been more privileged than himself. And this was a motivation that drove him through, in fact, much of his career, I think. Now, in the 1920s, he followed fashion, but he also tried to demonstrate his great versatility, making a large number of silent movies each year, many of them not full feature length, perhaps 40 minutes, 50 minutes, perhaps an hour. And they were in many, many different styles. Some were quasi-documentaries, some were extremely melodramatic, one or two were avant-garde, one or two in the late part of the 1920s were quasi-Marxist. He took part briefly in a movement known as tendency filmmaking, which was to say films designed to, in an almost agitprop spirit, to open up the divisions in society, particularly between the haves and have-nots. However, as we enter the 1930s, Mizoguchi went through some kind of extraordinary change. It was not at all surprising that any young man, intellectually active and artistically active in the 1920s in Japan, would have the kind of interests and the range of activities that Mizoguchi demonstrated. What was very surprising in the 1930s was that he turned his back on most of that experimentation and focused instead on a genre also in Japanese theatre called shimpa. Now, shimpa is pre-Shingeki. Shimpa was, I suppose the nearest Western equivalent would be the Victorian melodrama. Shinpa was a form of theatre that came into being in the Meiji period when Japan was opening up after its many centuries of being closed to the outside world. And it was designed as a channel to bring in ideas from abroad, often plays from abroad. Shakespeare was performed in Shinpa theatres, for example, and to do it in a way that would differentiate the theatre practice from the traditions of, for example, the kabuki theatre, which was, of course, deeply traditionally Japanese. So shimpa was performed without exaggerated makeup. It was performed without a joruri commentator sitting at one side of the stage and informing the audience what was going on. It was performed without continuous musical accompaniment, but it was highly melodramatic and it was usually deeply tragic. Now, Mizoguchi had a profound empathy with shimpa, partly, perhaps, I mean, I'm speculating here, but partly because maybe he saw his own life as some kind of shimpa tragedy. He was a man who had, after all, been supported through the crucial years when he became apprenticed to a kimono maker and tried to pursue his interests in painting and design by his sister, who essentially gave up her own ambitions for her life and married a wealthy man in order to support her siblings. He felt from an early age very much indebted to the self-sacrificing woman. So it may well be that Mizoguchi saw his life as in some sense a shimpa tragedy. Now, Mizoguchi's rather eccentric lurch back towards shimpa, I think, had two valencies. First, it allowed him to channel his interest in formalism, which was a developing thing and a very forward-looking thing. It was in the 1930s that he developed the famous one scene, one cut technique, whereby he developed, I think, what we would call the sequence shot, the entire scene of a film taken in one continuous take with no internal editing. He became known for that, and it climaxed in his wartime film, The Loyal 47 Ronin. It also allowed him to theatricalize the notion of performance in the films. More and more his films include sequences that actually take place in theatres, and more as the 30s go on, his characters are theatre actors who are seen both on stage and off stage. He becomes obsessively interested in the notion that performance is a key part of life. And the resonance of that, of course, is that even when we're not on a stage, perhaps we are, in some sense, performing. This is a kind of motif that also preoccupied the very otherwise extremely dissimilar director Billy Wilder. Now, in the 40s, particularly after the American occupation, Mizoguchi relished the chance to work without the same kind of front office interference that he'd been suffering for much of the 1930s and the wartime years. And he celebrated his newfound freedom in the late 40s by making a series of very angry, almost militant feminist melodramas, which were much more vicious and dynamic in tone than anything he'd done before that point. However, they did carry forward both of his innovations from the 1930s. They still talked about theatre questions, particularly in the film The Love of the Actress Sumako, but not only in that one, and also his interest in the extended take and what you could do formally by doing away with editing as such, as much as possible. In these films of the 1950s, however, a new dynamic comes into play. I think we can see the traces of both the angry feminist melodramas of the late 40s here, and we can see something of the formalism of the 1930s films, in the preference for extended takes and the reluctance to edit, or the desire to edit only when the cut will produce a very specific, clear effect. However, the element that's new and determining much of what Mizoguchi is doing in a film like this has been a new rivalry in his life. The crucial turning point in Japanese cinema occurred in 1951 when Kurosawa's film Rashomon won the top prize in the Venice Film Festival. Rashomon was also produced by Daiei Company, also produced by Nagata Masaichi, although Nagata was so convinced that this film was a complete disaster, he didn't initially have his name on it. It was only after the Venice Prize that Mr. Nagata's name very prominently appeared on the credits of the film, as it did at the beginning of this one. You noticed, if you remember, that it was the first credit to appear after the main title. The success of Kurosawa was something that I think needled Mizoguchi to some degree. Kurosawa is actually not that much younger than Mizoguchi, perhaps only a matter of 10 years or so. However, he was in film terms a relative newcomer at the time that he won the prize in Venice. Kurosawa was effective, well, he had worked as an assistant director in the 1930s, notably for Yamamoto Kajiro, but he began directing only during the war years, and his rise to some kind of artistic identity of his own occurred in the late 40s and early 1950s. That meant, in Mizoguchi's terms, he was something of a newcomer. Mizoguchi was somebody, after all, who had been directing since 1923. So Mizoguchi had a great body of work behind him at this point and was widely recognized by Japanese critics as one of the key directors of the country. Now, we know from the memoirs of Yoda Yoshikata, Mizoguchi's regular writer, that Mizoguchi felt this rivalry with Kurosawa very keenly. And I think we can see Ugetsu as one of his most dramatic responses to that sense of competition that existed between them, perhaps only in his head. The previous year's Life of Oharu had, in some sense, looked back to his 1930s practice. It had been a film constructed almost entirely in sequence shots and had a very stately, tragic air to it. Ugetsu is rather different. Mizoguchi's visual style, his storytelling, has evolved away from the formalism, away from the extremes of melodrama, into this Hollywood-style fluidity. It doesn't have the obsessive editing of a Hollywood film, but it does have the dynamism, the pacing, the constant forward thrust. And the fact that he still has this preference for extended takes and wide-angle shots reminds us of what Jacques Rivette said in one of the earliest critiques in France of this film. He said Mizoguchi's art is an art of modulation. Mizoguchi, as a matter of personal choice, I think, alternated as much as possible jidaigeki, historical films, and gendaigeki, contemporary stories. By and large, it was the historical ones that attracted the world's attention. The West was much more open to exotic historical dramas than it was to films looking at present-day social difficulties in Japan. Mizoguchi obviously noticed that. His producers certainly noticed that. It had already been intimated, in fact, by the success of both Kurosawa with Rashomon and of Kinugasa with Gate of Hell. The first two Japanese films to win major international prizes both were jidaigeki, historical dramas. The Japanese film industry perceived very quickly that if they wanted to make films that could be sold overseas and indeed win prestige and prizes overseas, they were more likely to do it with historical dramas than present-day ones. So Mizoguchi came under heavy pressure in the late films to stick with history. Now we're into one of the most famous sequences in the film, the crossing of Lake Biwa through heavy mist. And this is the first sequence in which the atmosphere is palpably ghostly, and it reminds us, of course, that the film is based on two famous ghost stories from Ueda Akinari's collection. You could argue that the intimations of ghostliness and the supernatural go right back to the beginning of the film. If you remember the very start, the Daiei trademark is already accompanied by Hayasaka Fumio's approximation of gagaku music, gagaku being the music of the Japanese imperial court, very plangent and rather ghostly itself in its atmosphere, and seemingly very anomalous when applied, as here, on the soundtrack to a story about peasant villagers living in a tiny village on the banks of Lake Biwa. But that disjunction between the courtly music and the very earthy peasant lives of these characters as an early intimation, you could say, into penetration of different levels of reality that is going to characterize the whole film. Here, though, we're still, for the moment, in a more or less realist vein. The main characters are drinking. Ohama has been designated the driver on this occasion because she's the one from a fishing family, so she's the one who knows about boats. The detail, incidentally, that the men are drinking sake on this boat as they cross the lake came from Mizoguchi himself. And when, in a moment, they meet a dying man on another boat, and the dying man asks for water and is instead given sake because it's all that they have, we know from Yoda Yoshikata's memoirs that this was a detail that came specifically from Mizoguchi himself. It was Mizoguchi's own idea. This, like many other things, does not appear in the source stories. It's neither in Ueda Akinari's stories, nor does it come from Maupassant. These are inventions from the two writers. Just to let you know where we're coming from here, let me sketch the two stories that form the basis of the film. One is called Asaji Gayado, or The House in the Thickets. It's set in the mid-15th century. It deals with the irresponsible son of a prosperous farmer who travels to Kyoto to sell silks and is then prevented from returning to his wife by an outbreak of war in the region. He's stripped of money and clothes by robbers, and he's taken in by some friendly villagers, and 7 entire years pass before his thoughts turn back to his wife and his home. He goes back to his village, he finds it almost unrecognizable, and his wife Miyagi has become a haggard shadow of her former self. Only the next morning does he learn that it was his wife's ghost who welcomed him. Now that clearly feeds into one strand of the screenplay here, but most of the detail is completely different from the film. Everything from the profession of the man to even the name of the man. The other story, called Jasei no In, or Lust of the Serpent, is apparently set in the Heian period, much earlier in Japanese history, and Mizoguchi takes that cue to set Princess Wakasa's mansion, which we'll see in a few minutes' time, as a Heian design. The story is about the younger son of a prosperous fisherman who's completely unsuited into following his father's trade, and he's captivated by a mysterious woman and longs to marry her. And only when a jeweled sword that she has given him is recognized as stolen property does he learn that she's a malevolent ghost. The woman and her young maid persecute him, first pursuing him to his sister's home and then taking possession of his intended fiancée. But an abbot from the Dojoji temple finally manages to capture the ghosts in their true forms as snakes and buries them in the temple grounds. Well, not much of that feeds into the screenplay of Ugetsu Monogatari, but we can recognize certain traits from it, and we can see how Mizoguchi has rather cunningly had the idea of interpolating the one story into the other story to explain the husband's extended absence from his wife. It so happens that both of these stories actually derive from Chinese originals, and the second one, Lust of the Serpent, is in fact rather familiar in its Chinese version. It's best known in Chinese as Madam Whitesnake and has been filmed and adapted for the Peking Opera stage and so on endlessly. I guess one of the most recent versions was by Choi Hak, the Hong Kong director, who made a film called Green Snake, starring Maggie Cheung as one of the snake spirits. Giving her some of her most undignified moments on the screen, I would have to say. Here, as I pointed out earlier, we're still in basically a realist register. And again, we know from Mizoguchi's notes to Yoda during the long period of writing the screenplay, it took something like 5 months to arrive at the final draft. His major concern was to stress the humanity of these characters. He wants the audience to come away from this sequence acutely aware that Genjuro genuinely regrets leaving his wife and child behind as they go on this doomed expedition to sell pottery in the nearest big town.
あなたも気をつけて、賊が出ても手向かわないでくださいよ。ああ、分かってる。表街道行っちゃダメだぞ。裏道を通ってさっき言った通り、美濃街道の裏山へ入るんだ。
I think in this film and in Sancho the Bailiff, that Mizoguchi's focus on the family shattered and seeking to regroup itself is partly circumstantial. I think it just happens that he picked 2 literary texts, literary sources that led him to those themes. But obviously it's not a complete accident, and I think you have to see this as some kind of response to what has happened to many Japanese families during the war years. A great many families have lost members in the war, either because the men were drafted and sent overseas and died overseas, or because they were wiped out in the carpet bombing of Japan by the Allies. So there's been a pattern of tragedies, and Mizoguchi is somehow responding to the families that were perforce broken up by war. In both this film, Ugetsu, and in Sancho the Bailiff, the climate of war is an essential part of the film's background, and it's clearly in both cases intended as some kind of reminiscence of or reflection on the experiences that Japan has recently lived through at the time that Mizoguchi is making the films. So we arrive in Omizo Market. This is a rather lavish recreation of a small town in the late 16th century. Again, very characteristic of Mizoguchi's very careful, almost obsessively detailed recreation of a historical past. And as you can see, although this was not a huge budgeted film, he was able to command the resources of the Daiei studio to produce a very large crowd of costumed extras. And these are not rhubarbing, vacuous extras. These are extras who have been very carefully directed and given very precise instructions as to how they are to behave, what they're to do, how they're to move, and so on. All of them, you notice, are also very individually costumed, all of which I think is testimony to Mizoguchi's determination to recreate a vanished past era with maximum vividness. Now, the point of this sequence, of course, is the first encounter with Princess Wakasa, who is, as we speak, bearing down on Genjiro at his market pitch. I think in narrative terms, this is quite self-explanatory, so let's say a little bit more now about the two men who take the writing credit for this film. The principal one is probably Yoda Yoshikata, who was about 11 years younger than Mizoguchi. He came to work with Mizoguchi from a background working in a bank initially. He'd been publishing what he now calls sentimental poetry in a little magazine. He was a confirmed atheist, and he had a mark leaning to the left. In fact, he'd been dragged off by the police for questioning at one time as a suspected communist, so he had every reason to dislike the growing militarist and anti-leftist climate of the 1930s. He worked consistently with Mizoguchi from the mid-30s right till his death 20 years later on very many films, and he published memoirs of Mizoguchi, initially in a series of magazine articles in Japan. They have been translated into French, not yet in extenso into English. In the particular case of Ugetsu, it's rather well documented in Yoda's memoirs because he reprints a series of letters that he received from Mizoguchi offering comments on successive drafts of the screenplay. Now, the other writer was Kawaguchi Matsutaro, and he was he had known Mizoguchi since primary school. They had been at school together briefly. They met again in the 1920s at the Nikatsu studio and again commenced a working relationship, which lasted right through to Mizoguchi's death. Kawaguchi at this moment was already one of the directors of the Daiei Film Company, so he was in effect one of Mizoguchi's bosses at this point. In the interim, he had become, in the 1930s, one of Japan's most prolific and popular pulp novelists. And when Mizoguchi invited him to work on this screenplay, he didn't write a screenplay, he wrote a novelization. It's reversing the usual pattern of turning a screenplay into a cheap novel. Kawaguchi started with the cheap novel and used that as the basis for screenplay ideas. Kawaguchi's other central importance in Mizoguchi's life is that he was one of the key figures in the development of Shimpa theater. And as we've already pointed out, Mizoguchi was very much drawn in the 1930s to Shimpa, turning his back on some of the more modernist ideas that had preoccupied him in the 1920s. So while Tobe is pursuing his militarist ambitions, his wife Ohama is left by herself and forlorn. And in this particular sequence, it provides a very good example of how Mizoguchi has adapted his famous long take aesthetic for the needs of a more dynamic kind of a drama like this one. Specifically, as you can see, by isolating Ohama and then surrounding her by 5 figures who we haven't previously seen, who come from some off-screen space, giving us a visual surprise as well as a dramatic surprise. Now, this sequence as a whole, which is the rape of Ohama, essentially, the beginning of her degradation, caused entirely by the neglect and foolishness of her husband, reminds us, I think, rather vividly of those feminist melodramas that Mizoguchi made in the late 1940s. He, more than almost any other Japanese director, responded very warmly to the new freedoms that came with the American occupation and the lifting of certain kinds of censorship. Of course, there were other kinds of censorship that were imposed in parallel with the new freedoms, but nonetheless. Mizoguchi responded with a whole series of films focused on the injustices faced by women in traditional Japanese society. And this sequence of Ohama's rape, which takes place, as you can see, inside a Buddhist temple, is very much consonant with the kind of things he did in Victory of Women, in Women of the Night, and most particularly in My Love Has Been Burning. Now, this shot, rather poignant and desolate, of her abandoned sandals lost in the struggle, is one of the few close-ups in the film, matched by the following close-up of the rapist contemptuously fishing in his purse for some coins to throw at her. More typical of the film strategy was the preceding shot in which Ohama's body was dropped into the foreground of the space inside the Buddhist temple. That's very typical of the way that Mizoguchi in this film likes to use foreground action in lieu of close-ups much of the time. That kind of shot has the same effect and emphasis as a close-up without actually the need for cutting to a close-up. Now, I think it's interesting that the rape scene is set in a Buddhist temple and takes place with this Buddhist chanting going on the soundtrack in the background. Mizoguchi, around this time, was supposedly converted to Buddhism by his producer, Nagata Masaichi, who was a devotee of Nichiren Buddhism. And it's said that when Mizoguchi went to Venice with the film, he took with him a Nichiren shonin figure and prayed to it in his hotel room to win the prize. Now, although Ugetsu does have a very strong spiritual and moral dimension, it's clearly not a religious film as such, and the fact that the rape of Ohama took place inside a Buddhist temple can only be perceived as a very ironic gesture on the filmmaker's part. Now, true to the pattern that it's already well established, the film is cross-cutting from one set of characters to another set of characters. And now, of course, we're back to Genjiro, and we're back to the developing strand of his supernatural infatuation, or his enchantment, you could say. Hayasaka Fumio, the film's composer, is at this point providing a rather plaintive shakuhachi flute solo on the soundtrack. It's part of a very elaborate tissue of music that accompanies the film. The music is notably all played on Japanese instruments. Some of it is Western-style film music, albeit given a distinctly Japanese inflection by the instrumentation. Now, Genjiro is setting off for the Kutsuki mansion and pauses at the kimono shop and gives us an introduction to what's going to be the defining structuring principle of the rest of the film, which is his subjectivity. We just saw his pan around the shop from which he had mentally edited out the stall holder. That principle of his subjective perception is going to be extended momentarily by the apparition of his beloved and absent wife, who he's going to fantasy project into this space. This is important because the supernatural element in the film is not so much reified by Mizoguchi as defined as a subjective hallucination. Nobody could accuse this of being a superstitious film. It uses the supernatural elements because this kind of delusion is something that the psyche is prone to, and Mizoguchi might argue, in the context of this story, particularly the male psyche is prone to. The motif of Miyagi trying on beautiful kimonos, again, relates to the earlier scene in which he gave her a kimono. It relates to later scenes in which he attempts to give kimono to Princess Wakasa as well. I think it's used by Mizoguchi primarily to indicate the shallowness of the man Genjiro. His wife repeatedly protested that she didn't want lavish gifts from him. This is not what she needed to fulfill herself. It was something that he refused to listen to. So Genjiro is pulled back from his reverie by the reappearance of Wakasa. And here we have the first close-up of Wakasa, and we see that she's played by Kyo Machiko. So this is producing a screen reunion, which is perhaps more important for the producer Nagata than it is for Mizoguchi himself. It's a reunion of the two stars of Rashomon, his big hit film of 1951. Of course, in that film, Mori Masayuki, who now plays Genjiro, was the husband, and Kyo Machiko, who now plays Wakasa, was the wife. Kyo Machiko looks nothing like she did in Rashomon, but that's because we've just seen here that she's wearing a makeup directly inspired by that worn on the mask of a female character in No Theatre. And for this particular strand of the film, everything set in Kutsuki Mansion and centering on Wakasa, Mizoguchi has chosen to take motifs and music from No Theatre as his governing images. Now, this is where the film moves wholeheartedly into the supernatural arena. It signaled the shift, if you like, with that rather extraordinary shot of shadows passing along the ground rather than the people themselves. And it begins the progressive transformation of the Kutsuki mansion, which, as we see, starts off as an overgrown, derelict ruin and gradually is restored to its former Heian-era glory, because it's inhabited by these spectral figures, but also because Genjiro's subjective consciousness recreates it. It fulfills his own inner ambition. Now, there was an earlier adaptation of this story in Japanese cinema. It was done in 1921 by a young man called Thomas Kurihara, who had actually studied in the States with Thomas Ince. He was one of the very few people in the Japanese film industry who had some knowledge and experience picked up in the emerging American film industry. He came back to Japan, and one of the 20-odd films he made in 1921 was an adaptation of this same story, Lust of the Serpent. It was actually adapted very prestigiously by the novelist Tanizaki Junichiro. The film is, of course, lost. We have no way of seeing it or knowing what it was like. But ironically, it seems to have been the only previous adaptation of one of the Ugetsu stories for Japanese cinema prior to this. Now, that fact, of course, underlines, it returns us to that caption at the beginning of the film in which Mizoguchi sought to stress how relevant and immediate all of this might be to a Japanese viewer in 1953. But what it underlines is the fact that it was actually quite eccentric to go back to these classical ghost stories as the basis for a film in 1953, when the emerging Japanese ghost story tradition was a very different one. It was a very much more populist one, very much less rooted in stories imported from China, and albeit Japanized in the process of import, and which fed into the horror and ghost story genres of the 1950s. Later this decade, a director like Nakagawa Nobuo is making at the Shintoho company film after film, parroting various Western horror movie and ghost story genres. There's a whole series of them, each one featuring a different type of ghost. The ghost cat, the vengeful ghost from the past, the vampire even in one film. Mizoguchi, well, nobody has ever considered Ugetsu, Mizoguchi's film, as a kaidan eiga story in Japan. This is not part of, nobody has ever perceived this as being part of the ghost story mainstream in Japanese popular culture, any more than the stories themselves were. So what Mizoguchi is doing here is, I think, less than laying the foundations for a coming popular genre of ghost horror fiction, than giving the story its semblance of psychological depth. As we noted earlier, these characters are not deeply psychologized. This is not a psychological study, and we're not invited to penetrate the recesses of the psyche of these people. We're more interested in them in terms of their predicament, which is usually expressed physically through their movement, through their dress, and through their behavior. However, insofar as the film does have a profound psychological dimension, and I believe that it does, and I think that that's one of the reasons that the film has as much emotional impact and resonance as it has, particularly in its closing scenes, the reason is that we are invited to explore Genjiro's subjective consciousness, and that is, as I've already tried to suggest, the dominant thing that's going on throughout these sequences in the Kutsuki mansion. Now, Mizoguchi, because he's not working in a popular idiom when he's making this film, he needed to find some way to represent what we can call the supernatural dimension of these scenes. And as I've already suggested, he opted for no theatre as his source. Now, in this, I think he was probably picking up a lead from Ueda Akinari himself, because, as the translator Leon Zolbrod has pointed out, the overall structure of the 9 stories in Ugetsu Monogatari, the book, directly echoes the structure of a no-theatre play. Mizoguchi has not attempted to reproduce that, I think, in the way he structured the film, but I think it gave him an artistic trigger, a clue, if you like, which he followed up. Very interestingly, this had a repercussion a few years later on the man he perceived as his arch-rival, although I don't think it was perceived mutually the other way, Kurosawa, because when Kurosawa had to deal with ghosts in his film Throne of Blood 4 years after this, he too turned to the idiom of no to represent the supernatural. And I don't think he probably would have done that had it not been for Ugetsu Monogatari. Now, in the real No theatre, there are no women. It's an all-male theatre. So by casting Kiyo Machiko and putting her into this human equivalent of a no mask, Mizoguchi is being, to a degree, provocative. But it once again returns us to the question of Genjiro's subjectivity. It's being underlined in other ways as well by having him talk to his own pots, which is about as deranged and subjective a thing as you can possibly do. But Mizoguchi, I think, is rather subtly reminding us that all of this is essentially taking place in Genjiro's head. This is a man who is acting out, at least mentally, his dreams of A, social advancement, B, recognition as an artist rather than just a humble craftsman, and C, a man enjoying the love of a spectacular, glamorous, exotic, and mysterious woman. So the supernatural things happen to Genjiro, only to Genjiro, actually. The other characters don't experience them. Tobei has no supernatural experiences, neither do either of the women. On the contrary, they suffer the ups and downs of war in all too literal and physical a way. It's interesting, though, if you look at it in the context of Mizoguchi's larger career, because there is no other example that I can think of an attempt to penetrate one individual's consciousness, least of all a man's, because many Mizoguchi films are focused resolutely on women and their experiences. But even in the case of the films that focus squarely on women, there is no example that comes to my mind of an attempt to enter a woman's consciousness to the extent of sharing her fantasies and using her fantasies as some means of exploring her psychology. Now, Mizoguchi, we know from his letters to Yoda during the writing, was very concerned that the supernatural and non-supernatural elements should be carefully integrated. He didn't want them to separate like oil and water. That was the metaphor he used repeatedly. And I think it's through Genjiro's subjectivity that he achieves that synthesis. Now, that cut is the nearest the film ever gets to a shock cut. All it is actually a change of perspective within the room, but it underlines an extremely shocking suggestion, which is that Genjiro should marry Wakasa. It's shocking because it transgresses all class boundaries, but also because it's so absurdly sudden. They've only met for probably, well, less than half an hour for sure. So it is on the face of it an absurd suggestion. But it leads into the swooning rapture of this and the following sequences. The first sequence in which Wakasa dances, the second sequence in which she completes and consummates her seduction of Genjiro. Now, as I've tried to suggest, this is essentially in his consciousness. It's all rationalized as being his wish fulfillment, his deepest fantasies. And I think that the way that Mori Masayuki plays it, this kind of swooning rapture, which requires him to be carried off by the servants, requires him to be disrobed and put into a much finer kimono, carries this off to perfection. It seems to me that this is the very image of the enraptured male. Now, this brings us to one of the film's most famous set pieces, which is Wakasa's dance. And it reminds us, perhaps, that Kiyo Machiko, who was almost 30 when she shot this film, began her career in show business at the age of 12 as a dancer. Mizoguchi, I think, is very conscious that in star terms, Kiyo Machiko is his major asset. This is certainly what the producer, Nagata Masaichi, would have felt. This is why Kiyo gets top billing, in fact, in the film's credits and on the poster. So this emphasis on her dancing in close-up is a rather phenomenal one. It's perceived as a rather extraordinary thing for a young woman to be performing a no dance. And certainly Kiyo Machiko has never looked like this before on screen. She joined Daiei, by the way, in 1949 when the company was founded, just after Nagata Masaichi's release from jail on his war criminal charges. And she had come to prominence, of course, in Rashomon, but she'd really consolidated her image in the minds of the Japanese public 1 year later in a film called Clothes of Deception, in which she played a geisha. It was directed by Yoshimura Kozaburo, who, interestingly enough, was the man who completed the Mizoguchi project that Mizoguchi was working on at the time of his death in 1956. Her appearance here in Ugetsu is actually her first work with Mizoguchi, but she appeared again for him 2 more times, first in Yankei Fei 2 years later, and then again in his final film, Street of Shame. Now, the song that she's singing while she performs this no-theatre dance is a rather Buddhist type of song, ironically. It's all about transience of mortal things, about the way that beauty inexorably fades. This has all kinds of resonances in the film as a whole, but Mizoguchi very vividly theatricalizes it by, as we just saw, dimming the lights and introducing this spectral male voice, which comes, it turns out, from the helmet of Wakasa's father. You wouldn't call this a whip pan exactly. It's done, of course, in a very stately and slow way, but it's probably the nearest the film will ever get to something like a whip pan, because it contains the element of surprise and shock and astonishment that the supernatural elements are intensifying. The appearance, at least on the soundtrack, of Wakasa's father provokes Ukon, who turns out to have a rather crucial role in this whole deception, into a bit of family history. And she references the fact that the Kutsuki clan was destroyed by Oda Nobunaga. This is part of what we noted at the very outset, the Mizoguchi's insistence on situating the story of the film in a very precise historical place and time. Oda Nobunaga, who was famously a warlord, has become one of the great ogres in the Japanese popular imagination. And so Mizoguchi here, by identifying him as the one responsible for the massacre of Wakasa's family, the Kutsuki clan, is pandering to popular prejudice. It's not until many years later, I think in Kurosawa's 1980 film Kagemusha, that Oda has his reputation rehabilitated to some degree. I mean, he's famously known in Japan as one of the most depraved of homosexual warlords, but it takes Kurosawa in 1980 to show him as a rather virile and pleasant man who is very kind to his page boys. I think Ugetsu was intended as a number of things, but primarily probably as some kind of critique of what Japan had been through in the 1930s and 1940s. As I tried to suggest earlier, that included the rise of militarism. That was obviously the central thing. It included the consequences, the social consequences, the moral consequences, and indeed the emotional consequences of being plunged into war, and the ruinous effect this had on relationships and families. Now, the climax of this sequence, which is essentially the seduction, I think we can infer from the fact that Genjiro is under the futon that seduction has been accomplished by this point. And certainly Wakasa is behaving as she retreats to her makeup table in the adjacent room like a woman who has achieved something that she set out to achieve. Mizoguchi, with great help from his composer Hayasaka Fumio, underlines this by using harp music at this point. It's part of a very rich tapestry of sounds on the soundtrack of this film. I noted earlier that nearly all of the instrumentation is Japanese, from the shakuhachi flute onwards. But here there's a very deliberate and conscious use of the harp, which is of course not a Japanese instrument, and it's playing not Japanese-style music either. I think that heightens the artifice of the moment. And, I mean, obliquely, it might remind us that what we're seeing here is something very paradoxical. Genjiro is apparently, to all surface appearances, asleep. And what he is imagining here, if we accept that this is essentially his subjective vision, is a glamorous, desired, exotic woman moving a lantern closer to him as he sleeps, the better to admire his beauty. Now, this is certainly a very flattering image for the male ego, but it may be that the underlying absurdity of the moment is somehow emphasized or at least suggested by the choice of harp music for the soundtrack at this point. Now, however Genjiro is flattering himself in terms of his sexual allure and his apparent appeal to this highborn woman, it is but a preface to the full-scale seduction which follows in the next two scenes. These scenes provide us with two of the great iconic images. In fact, I think that stills from these scenes are probably the two most widely reproduced Japanese film stills of the 1950s. And of course, it's rather ironic that they are stills, because in the film they're not stills, they're part of these rather elegant, sweeping, rapturous panning shots. which are absolutely typical of Mizoguchi's method throughout this film, that of creating maximum fluidity in the movement of the people and the exploration of the space that they inhabit. Here, he's doing a number of things. First, he's taking advantage of the new liberalism. The American occupation, which formally ended the year before this film was made, had liberated Japanese cinema to deal with erotic questions more freely than it had in the pre-war years. At the same time, it had banned any treatment of things that threw back to the feudal past, so anything that smacked of emperor worship or restoration of imperial divinity and that kind of thing was out. But eroticism was in, and Mizoguchi had explored that new freedom rather fully in his films of the late 40s. Here, with this image of misbehavior in a hot spring, he's also transgressing a Japanese taboo. You don't misbehave in hot springs. They're desexualized places, or at least they were traditionally. You don't perceive the nudity of your fellow bathers, and it doesn't have an erotic current. Through that exquisite mix from one shot to another shot, both of them panning, thereby preserving the overall motion of the camera, he takes us to the most surreal image probably in the film, a picnic on the banks of the lake, which takes place in what seems to be a Zen garden, somehow magically transposed to the exterior. We saw this raked sand that we panned over. And the point of these images, the point of these sequences, in fact, is to promote an image of male ecstasy. There are very many male directors who've made films about female ecstasy. It's quite rare to find any male director who focuses on male ecstasy. But that's what this is about. This is the apotheosis of Genjiro feeling that he's in paradise in some way. Incidentally, one of the ideas that Mizoguchi pitched to his bosses when he proposed the film in the first place was not only adapting Ueda's stories with some ideas from Maupassant, but also something in the visual style of Salvador Dali paintings. Obviously, that idea wasn't followed through, but perhaps in that image of the picnic on the bank of the lake, we have some vestige of the infatuation with Dali's imagery. Because the West discovered Mizoguchi quite late in his career, shortly before his death, in fact, we came to know the late films long before we discovered the early films. And the collaboration with Miyagawa Kazuo, the cinematographer, was seen as a central one for Mizoguchi. I think it was a central one in that late period. But Miyagawa didn't bring to Mizoguchi any particular aesthetic innovations. If we look at Mizoguchi's career in some kind of totality, you can see that all the strategies, the visual strategies, particularly the extended takes, the predilection for wide-angle shots, of action being at some distance from the camera, the use of the foreground in lieu of close-ups, that kind of strategy, all has direct precedence in Mizoguchi's earlier films that were not shot by Miyagawa Kazuo. Now, what Mizoguchi does here, and it's a slightly opportunistic thing to do, I suppose you could say, because it's a very deus ex machina strategy on the part of the writers, is introduce one character just very, very briefly. She has no continuing presence in the film. It's an old lady who either lives in or works in this space and who performs an act of kindness to help Miyagi. She feeds her and guides her to safety out the back way. Now, I think the significance of this is not so much the character, it is the act of kindness itself, the act of feeding. And it's designed to not only return us to the real world, away from those subjective fantasies of male ecstasy, but also to a real world in which ordinary, common people are kind to each other, even in the most adverse circumstances. And the rest of the sequence is designed to show us just how adverse those circumstances can be. This is the most protracted view we've yet had of soldiers misbehaving. And it shows us how out of control the military was in this period. At the risk of hammering home a point that's a little too obvious, Mizoguchi lived through the 1930s and the rise of extreme militarism in Japan, the way that militarism gradually took over the functions of government and increasingly overruled the national diet in deciding what should be national policy. And the fact that he's making this film in 1953 in a slightly changed Japan is not an accident, I think, because he's inviting his viewers to think back to the fairly recent past, the pre-war and war years and reflect on what they might mean in terms of a Japanese tradition and in terms of what was lost during those years. Now, what we're seeing here is, of course, the death of Miyagi. And although this is of basically tragic, melodramatic significance in itself, I think what's important for Mizoguchi in terms of what comes next is the way he shows it. Of course, there is no close-up of the spear entering Miyagi's belly, but it's pretty clear to us that Miyagi has been mortally wounded. The fact that it happened away from our sight, the fact that her back was to us when the spear entered her body, the fact that she struggles to carry on, the fact that the soldiers are eating the food they stole from her in the background of the shot as she screams in pain and collapses, is significant in terms of what follows. And what does follow is a return to our next missing protagonist, Tobei. First, though, we see two people we haven't seen before. One turns out to be a military commander known as Fuwa Katsushige, and he's being helped by his adjutant through the reeds to the grounds of a temple. We may think, I'm not sure if it's true or not, that this is the same temple where Ohama was raped a little while ago. If it's not the same temple, it certainly looks like it. I mean, of course, one small Buddhist temple looks much like another, so that's not surprising. But I think Mizoguchi intends us to at least think back to Ohama's rape when he shows us this scene. Now, what's happening here is that Fuwa, who is mortally wounded, is asking his adjutant to end his life. And this is absolutely in line with the codes of Bushido, the way of the warrior. He is doing the honorable thing and asking his adjutant to behead him. This is of significance primarily in plot terms because of what happens to the head and what it means for Tobei, who is watching from under the foundations of the temple. Mizoguchi is, of course, very discreet in a way that later filmmakers would not be visually by not showing us the beheading. But I think it's done graphically enough to make the violence very palpable and to make the trauma of the moment very intense. But I think his real interest is what happens next, because Tobei at this point intervenes and stabs the adjutant so that he can steal the head. And the interesting thing is that the stabbing of the adjutant almost exactly visually echoes the killing of Miyagi in the previous scene. And I think this kind of correspondence, in this case a visual correspondence, tips us the wink as to Mizoguchi's aesthetic strategies in the rest of the film. More and more from this point on, he is going to create parallels, visual parallels, thematic parallels, even musical and dialogue parallels in some occasions, from one set of characters to the other, in order to build a gradual sense of homogeneity and to restore the links that have sundered these people into three separate storylines. So the overall drive of the film is towards wholeness and completion, which is certainly the point at which it ends. Now, just as Genjiro's ecstasy a couple of scenes back was the sort of apotheosis of that character's ambitions, these scenes are the apotheosis of Tobei's military ambitions. And I think in the character's stupidity and the character's vaingloriousness, I guess would be the word if it's not too dated, I think we can see Mizoguchi's reflection on the militarism of the 1930s. It's interesting to look back at his own career in the 1930s. Mizoguchi was associated broadly with the left, and certainly Yoda, his regular writer, was also a figure from the left. And as I said earlier, in the late 1920s, he made a number of films defined at the time as leftist. He was even hauled in by the police to account for one of them at one time. Incidentally, this kind of rather clunky gossiping between the extras about who and what Tobei is exactly the kind of thing that Mizoguchi spent most of the letters to Yoda arguing against. He wanted dialogue that would be not just functional, but actually expressive and would avoid cliche. And I have to say that I think the two scriptwriters, this is probably their worst moment in the film in a way, fell back on very standard cliche when they have soldiers in Tobei's new retinue gossiping about who he is and why he's so eminent. However, it's a passing thing because it leads us back to the focus on Tobei's ascendancy as a military man and the question of how much this might or might not reflect Mizoguchi's own experience in the 1930s as well as the national experience. As I said, Mizoguchi started off the 30s as a perceived leftist and was hauled into account for himself on at least one occasion. However, by 1932, he was making a film celebrating Japanese military victories in Manchuria, named Manchu Kuo, as we, I'm sure, all remember from Bertolucci's film The Last Emperor, if we haven't actually read the history. So Mizoguchi, like most artists in the 1930s, followed the tide of the times. He was in some sense a resistor. He clearly objected to authoritarianism. Clearly he objected to being bossed around by anybody himself. Whether this equated to an ideological objection to the rise of militarism is another question, but he certainly had aesthetic objections to it. Whether or not they were political is perhaps a moot point. In any case, I think in the characterization of Tobei in these scenes, in which, as we've noted, he reaches some kind of apotheosis, I think we can see a distorted image of the way that the Japanese people in the 1930s, Japanese men in the 1930s, allowed themselves to be seduced by the lure of military glory. This may well have had some kind of autobiographical resonance for Mizoguchi. We know, for example, that when he was first taken to China as a guest of the military, he relished his role. Yoda has reported in graphic detail how Mizoguchi became something of a martinet himself and loved being the center of attention, loved being the honored guest, loved the kind of status that was conferred on him, and was completely oblivious to the colonial implications of the situation. Now, maybe there's some rueful self-awareness then in the characterization of Tobei here, although I don't think that Mizoguchi sees Tobei exactly as a self-image. But nonetheless, Tobei clearly is a caricature, an exaggeration of the Japanese drive for militarism and military glory, military personal status, as it transpired in the 1930s. And the way that Mizoguchi has dramatized it in the film is full of a heightened sense of absurdity. It is essentially comic, I guess. The comedy, however, is undercut almost immediately by this, which is the re-encounter with Ohama, who has been reduced to prostitution. However, her character has not changed. She remains the feisty woman. She remains the woman who is more than capable of holding her own with recalcitrant men and indeed beating them up if necessary. Now, her gesture of helping herself to the contents of the man's purse is, of course, a direct visual echo of what the rapist did when he raped her and fished in his own purse for some coins, which he then contemptuously threw to her on the ground on the floor of the temple. That's one more of this pattern of internal references and echoes which are designed to, as I suggested before, homogenize the action from this point on. More and more you'll find images that refer back to earlier images in the film, either parodically or reversing the meaning of the original time, or simply tending to draw things together. Now, this strand of the film, this particular moment, the reunion of Tobei and his wife, we learn from Mizoguchi's letters to Yoda during the scripting process, is drawn from yet another Maupassant source. It's a very glancing one, but it's a story called Lit 29, Bed 29, in which a man finds his lost wife in the venereal ward of a hospital. Mizoguchi took that idea and transposed it to this with the rediscovery of Ohama in a brothel. Maupassant was a popular favorite in Japan, and Mizoguchi certainly will have read everything in translation. In the Meiji period, when Japan opened up after so many years of being closed, there was a great rush to translate Western literature, and a great deal was available in Japanese by the end of the century. Maupassant was an early and popular favorite, and according to the Japan Pen Club, which chronicled the process of translations in the late 19th century, Maupassant was almost fully translated by about 1880. So, well before Mizoguchi was born, the complete canon of Maupassant was readily available in Japanese. And as I think I noted earlier, Mizoguchi had already adapted the story Boule de Suif into his 1935 film Maria the Virgin. It's the same story that John Ford ended up doing as Stagecoach. This shot, which climaxes the reunion of Tobei and Ohama, is also a very good example of Mizoguchi's method here of moving from wide shot to close-up without a cut. The character's fraught reconciliation, it is a kind of reconciliation, is affected by having them move into close-up, back from close-up, and eventually fading out on the wide shot. Now we're back to the story of Genjiro, and we're back also to the kimono shop. So this is yet another of the internal echoes and correspondences that, as I've suggested, are dominating the film in its closing scenes here, closing stages. The transaction with the kimono seller, of course, directly echoes the first encounter, although the angle is different this time. But its function this time is to take us, start easing us out of the supernatural elements in the film. The kimono seller is the first person to recognize that Genjiro has been in some sense enchanted, and he backs away from this in horror. This reaction is taken a little bit further in the immediately following scene with this Buddhist priest who is as humble as they come, humble to the extent that he's traveling with his prayer mat on his head. He, I have to say, is a slightly clunky invention of the scriptwriters in that his fortuitous passing, his fortuitous glance at Genjiro's face, his fortuitous discovery that Genjiro has been enchanted and is in mortal risk of losing his life and his soul is all very opportune. But I think in the context of the film and in the context of this rather sophisticated retreat from the supernatural, which is in effect a retreat from Genjiro's subjective consciousness into a more objective consciousness, which is where, after all, the film began. The film is now pulling back from the fantasy and slowly easing us back into some kind of objective world in which we're able to take stock of what we've seen and rationalize those apparently inexplicable supernatural elements that we've been watching for the last half hour. Now, the humble priest, the fact that this takes place in a Buddhist temple inevitably reminds us again of Ohama's rape. And yet again, it's one of those ways that Mizoguchi and his writers are homogenizing the content of the film by producing settings that remind us of earlier scenes in the picture. They're drawing various disparate threads together. I think this is a very sophisticated strategy, given that you have a storyline which involves the central characters splitting up, following their own paths, and the filmmaker cross-cutting between them, inviting us to follow the ascendancy of one with the decline of another, and so on. It's very essential that somehow these strands, disparate as they are, should be brought back together again. And although the narrative is eventually going to reconcile these people, as it just did Ohama and Tobei in the previous scene, it's rather significant, I think, that Mizoguchi chooses to do it aesthetically as well, through this pattern of correspondences, echoes, and reversals. Now, the fact that there is this network of Buddhist references and images in the film has led some commentators, Western commentators, to suggest that the film is heavily influenced by Buddhist theology. I think that is very far from the truth. I mean, although Mizoguchi reputedly did convert to Buddhism around this time in his life, I don't think the film bears witness to that in any respect. The reason that there are Buddhist references in the film, and they range from this humble, down-home, traveling priest Buddhism to the Zen Buddhism reference of the raked Zen garden, is because these things exist in Japan. It's part of the cultural continuum of Japan, and it's part of the tradition that Mizoguchi is seeking to reference and illuminate in some way, as much as, for example, the kimonos are. Kimonos are equally a motif running through the film, from the initial gift to his wife Miyagi, through the visits to the kimono shop, to this gift of kimonos to Wakasa. This is the denouement, of course, of the supernatural strand. It's the moment when the ghosts are going to be, in effect, exorcised, and they're exorcised incidentally. The exorcism is consolidated anyway by the appearance of not a Buddhist priest, but a Shinto priest, which is one further piece of evidence that Buddhism is not all that crucial to the schema of the film. Anyhow, the film is reaching the climax of this strand of its action, and we can see, very interestingly, I think, the way that Wakasa's makeup, which is that of a no-theatre mask, as we've said, is here being inflected, mostly by her eyes, I think. The makeup itself is not changing, but we're reading it differently. We're reading her disturbance. We're reading her sense that something is going wrong. We're reading her sense that perhaps the end is near. And we're reading a hint, at least, of her anger with Genjiro for not fulfilling what she sees as his part of the bargain. Interestingly, you can do that with a mask-like makeup, but it's evidence, I guess, of both lighting skill, performing skill, and the sophistication of Mizoguchi's conception in the way he's using this strand of no-theatre imagery. However, the climax here, which is not exactly visceral, but is certainly very convulsive, with Genjiro flailing around the room with the sword, the antique sword, I think in a way you could say that this highlights the underlying tension that has been there all the way through the film between Mizoguchi's aesthetic ambitions and his producer Nagata Masaichi's commercial intentions. Mizoguchi himself has referred a number of times to his dissatisfaction with the front office interference. So in 1954, 1 year after making Ugetsu, he gave a lengthy interview to the magazine Kinema Junpo, it's Japan's leading film magazine, in which he discussed all of the films he'd made to this point. And his comments about Ugetsu Monogatari are quite interesting. They're not at all as gung-ho as you might expect for such a successful film. He says, "This too was a film I'd long wanted to make, but I'm not very satisfied with the result as it stands. My own reading of Ugetsu is harsher." He then goes on to explain how the story of Tobei was different in his conception from the one that ended up in the film, and we'll come to that when we reach the climax of that storyline. But he goes on to say, in general, it's hard to work with businessmen in companies. When I went over to Europe, they told me that Life of Oharu was a better representation of humanity than Ugetsu. They said that Ugetsu's story was too artificial. As I left Europe, I was told that the film didn't have the stature of a Grand Prix winner. Now, he's referring slightly bitterly to the fact that in Venice in 1953, no Grand Prix was awarded. His Silver Lion for this film was actually the top prize awarded at the festival that year. The runner-up, incidentally, was Fellini's I Vitelloni. However, it must have rankled with him at some level that his film was not considered to be quite good enough to warrant the Grand Prix, although it was the best of the films on offer in the eyes of the jury. Well, he attributes that shortfall, if you consider it a shortfall, to front office interference, to the interference indeed of his old friend, Mr. Nagata, the producer of the film, who forced him to change various things. And he feels that if he'd been able to follow through his full conception, which is somewhat harsher and somewhat less reconciliatory, if we can say, in the climax of the film, then he would have actually produced a stronger, more powerful work which would have had more impact on its Western viewers. Whether that's true or not is a matter of speculation, but I certainly think that this scene here of the exorcism, which is in some degree redolent of, shall we say, a more popular kind of ghost story movie, much less in tune with the finer aesthetic achievement that we've had in earlier scenes in the Kutsuki mansion, maybe bears witness to that tension between Mizoguchi and his producer. What's going on, of course, is that his body has been inscribed in Sanskrit, with basically Buddha's words have been written on his body in Sanskrit. This is, just in case you're not sure, equally unintelligible to a Japanese viewer as it is to you or me, since very few people in the world by this point were fluent in written Sanskrit. However, it has the same effect as garlic on a vampire, or the sign of a cross on a vampire, I suppose. It repels the spirits, and in this particular case, drives them away. So it signals the end of as I said, the supernatural strand in the film. The fact that with his first sword stroke, Genjiro managed to snuff out one candle, and now flailing about the rapidly decaying mansion, he manages to knock over another one, introduces the interesting teasing idea that maybe he somehow burns down his own fantasy of what this mansion is. When we finally see the mansion in some kind of objective reality in this next sequence, as he ultimately retreats from his subjective fantasy into the real world, the mansion is revealed to be just a series of charred struts. There's almost nothing there at all, bar the two kimono that he recently bought for his phantom lady. Now, the priest who is pulling him back into the objective world is not a Buddhist priest this time, but a Shinto priest. Shinto, of course, being the national religion, the official national religion of Japan, is essentially a kind of pantheism, a kind of glorified nature worship. It doesn't have sacred texts. And I think we can infer from the characterization of this Shinto priest, who seems to be principally interested in the value of the sword, and whose dress, you'll notice, is a great deal more opulent and refined than that of the Buddhist priest who we saw a couple of scenes ago, is perhaps somewhat mercenary. And the fact that what little money Genjiro has about his person is promptly taken from him tends to confirm that impression. There's also one of the better jokes in the screenplay, I think, in this notion that Genjiro would be thrown into jail had the jail not been recently burned down in the Civil War, which in turn returns us to this question of the mansion, which, as we see now rather clearly, is but a charred wreck. Now, the recurrence of Wakasa's song on the soundtrack at this point is yet another example of internal reference within the film, but it's a particularly poignant one, I think, insofar as the film, unlike the original story, in which the Phantom is unequivocally a villainous figure, she has been returned to some kind of life in order to taste the joys of the flesh, which were denied her in her all too brief actual life, and that idea, of course, has been preserved in this screenplay. But she's not a villainess. Mizoguchi and his writers refuse to see her as such. And it's not just because Kiyo Machiko is cast in the role, it's because they respect her desires as a woman and bitterly regret the fact that she was cut off in her prime by the Civil War. So it's part of the film's pattern of recognition of the damage that war does to individual lives, which again has all too many resonances in the recent past at the time the film was made. And Wakasa's song, so poignantly regretting the transience of things, relates, I think, rather vividly to that. Now, this retreat from the supernatural has a certain ironic force. Genjiro has now returned to the objective world, and specifically to his own village, which we're now seeing actually from a different perspective from the one we've seen before. This is a different view, but all of the same set. And it's only the broken shards of pottery, as we saw them being destroyed by the soldiers in an earlier scene, that remind us that not much has changed in this place. So we have his homecoming, and what we have next in the shot seen from inside the house is probably the most extraordinary and creative use of the sequence shot in the whole film. This is one take, panning first right and then left and then right again, in which, as I'm sure you know by now, Miyagi is going to miraculously appear in a place where she wasn't the first time. We know, because we've seen her die already in the film, that she must be a ghost welcoming him back, and that indeed is an element taken from the Ueda Akinari story in the first instance. Mizoguchi, I think, treats it rather differently from Ueda, in that his focus here is actually on the character of Miyagi. It is her homeliness, her devotion that is being emphasized here, and indeed through all the scenes that follow right up to the end of the film. What's interesting about the sequence shot here in relation to what Mizoguchi used to do in films of the 1930s, such as Tale of Late Chrysanthemums, is that in earlier films, his sequence shots were essentially pictorial. They were formalist in a way that was designed to produce a fluidity of imagery, a continuity of action, while describing the formal parameters of a certain film language, a certain way of telling a story cinematically. Here, the gesture is a quite different one because the aim is primarily dramatic. In a sense, it's not that different from the moment when Ohama was suddenly surrounded by soldiers who hadn't been seen in the shot before. But here I think it's a more striking case because showing us a space in one way and then returning to the same space to show it changed is not some cheap special effect, although it must have been achieved by some kind of special effect, but a very poignant reification of Miyagi's homeliness, her devotion as a wife, which, as I said before, I think is the central focus of these closing scenes of the film. So Mizoguchi brings the family back together, thereby reifying the family unit, and thereby bringing back or consolidating or repairing the breaks which have dominated the entire action of the film. Now, this extended take climaxes with first the family unit, the three of them, but then it narrows into a closer shot of Miyagi. Mizoguchi is working for the fifth or sixth time with his favorite actress, Tanaka Kinuyo. And this, I think, is her finest moment in this film. If we're talking about Mizoguchi's art as one of modulation, that modulation is played out on her face in this extraordinary shot, in which she shows full awareness of her own status as a ghost, of all that has been lost, of all that has been regained by reuniting the father and son in her maternal way. She's more, I think, of a mother than a wife, it must be said. This is not Tanaka Kinuyo's most challenging screen role, but it is a very iconic one. Mizoguchi liked her for all kinds of reasons, I think. The key one probably being that she incarnated a certain kind of devoted, obsessive love for man and a willingness to sacrifice her own interests for those of her man, perhaps better than almost any other actress. How this corresponds to Mizoguchi's general sense of feminism is a moot question, one open for much argument, I guess. But it's quite interestingly refracted on what happened 1 year later when Tanaka Kinuyo, who had been in effect Mizoguchi's muse since 1940 when she first acted for him, broke that relationship. And the reason that she broke it was because in 1954, 1 year after making this film, she was invited to direct her second film. She was actually invited to take over a film that was supposed to be directed by somebody else. And Mizoguchi, who was by then a big noise in the Directors Guild, actively moved to oppose this. Tanaka Kinuyo never forgave him and never worked with him again. Very curious. Nobody has ever satisfactorily explained this turn of events, but it seems that there were very strong constraints on Mizoguchi's feminism, on his sense of what women could and should be capable of and allowed to do. Well, maybe that in turn has some bearing on what's happening now, which is the swan song of Miyagi in the film. And she's being the ideal mother. She's mothering both her son and her husband, not only by covering him with some kind of blanket. Actually, I think it's one of the kimono that he bought for her earlier, but also tidying away his sandals and sitting in the dark, reflecting on her own bitter transience. Now, this scene, I think, is designed to also remind us of the seduction scene with Wakasa in the Kutsuki mansion. You remember when Wakasa came back from her toilet room where she'd been adjusting her makeup and moved the lantern closer to the sleeping Genjiro. This is, I think, Miyagi's version of that moment when she comes to him as he sleeps soundly with his son, and she makes sure that he's tucked in, that he's warm, and that everything is properly arranged around him. Now, on the soundtrack at this point, comes back for the first time, really, since the very beginning of the film, that Gagaku-style music, the imperial court music. When we heard the Gagaku-style music at the beginning of the film, it was a disjunction. There was an obvious mismatch between this courtly music, very elegant, and these rather humble peasant characters. Now that it recurs at this point in the film, it's very clearly associated with the reappearance as a ghost of Miyagi, and it becomes much more clearly rationalized. We understand what the function of this music is. It represents evanescence, it represents the transience of things, it has that elegant, plangent, plaintive quality, and it's associated precisely with the fact that this supremely homely, loving mother, who mothers both her child and her husband, has come back from the grave to perform one last act of caring for the two men in her life, the two kids in her life, you could say. Now, in narrative terms, there's not much to say about the rest of the film. I think it's almost completely self-explanatory. So this gives us a chance to wrap up a few other points about the movie. We're going to go from this resolution with the village chief and the revelation of what's been happening with Genichi, the son, into the resolution of the Tobei story in a moment. And the Tobei story was one of the main points of contention between Mizoguchi and his producer. Mizoguchi did not want Tobei to see the error of his ways. He wanted him to continue his rise to prominence in military circles and there to be no reconciliation with his injured and abused wife. That would have been probably truer to what happened in the 1930s, and in Mizoguchi's view, it would have been truer to human nature, where most such men don't get their comeuppance, but actually live to become arrogant bullies. However, Nakata Masaichi, the producer of the film, was unwilling to accept that. And as Mizoguchi mentioned in the interview I referred to earlier with Kinema Junpo, in the original script, the man played by Ozawa Sakai didn't reform himself in the last scene, but continued his climb up the social scale. For some strange commercial reason, the company told us to make the ending sweeter. So it was his major bone of contention with the producers. This is thrown into some kind of interesting perspective if we look at what else was going on in Japanese cinema at this time. If we try and adopt for a moment the producer Nakata's perspective on all of this. In 1953, Daiei, Nakata's company, released 54 features, of which this was just one. That obviously is slightly over one a week. So Daiei was a large and prolific company, churning out films at quite a rate. Just for perspective, Shochiku Company in the same year, 1953, released 75 features, almost half as many again. And the Shochiku output, of course, included famously Ozu's Tokyo Story in 1953. A total, I looked into this to prepare for this commentary, and it seems that 305 Japanese features were released domestically in 1953. In the same year, 1953, 188 imported foreign films were released. They included things like Sternberg's last film Saga of Anatahan, Buñuel's Los Olvidados, Orpheus' film Le Plaisir, and Billy Wilder's Double Indemnity. And just for anecdotal interest, 1 week before this, or 6 days before this, released in Japan was Vincente Minnelli's Father's Little Dividend. On the same day that Mizoguchi's Ugetsu opened, Joseph M. Newman's Pony Soldier opened, a film with Tyrone Power as a Canadian Mountie. And 1 week later, Gene Kelly and Stanley Donen's Singing in the Rain opened. So that was the context in which the producer, Nagata Masaichi, was seeking to impose commercial considerations on his director. Mizoguchi, of course, was a very old friend of Nagata's, as we've tried to stress earlier, and valued, I think, this long association and felt that it gave him certain freedoms to make the kind of films that he wanted. But it would be naive to think of Mizoguchi as an ivory tower artist who was ploughing his own furrow, going his own way, and doing pretty much what he liked. Quite a number of the films that he made over the years were commercial impositions from producers. They were films not of his own choosing. And even when he did make a film of his own choosing, such as Ugetsu, there were pressures on him to change it, to inflect it, to give it certain character and form that were perhaps not what he first thought himself. In other words, Mizoguchi was, like nearly every other director working in this most compromised of film industries, a jobbing director who was subject to all the pressures. Now this, rather beautifully, is the the last of the major internal echoes in the film. We have a shot exactly like the earlier one, in which you recall Miyagi was in the background turning the second wheel and fending off attentions from Genichi the son. Here we have Genjiro turning his own wheel and the second wheel standing immobile in the background. But Miyagi is still there. She's still there on the soundtrack. And what she's saying in death is pretty much exactly what she said in life, which is, I'm with you always, I'm supporting you, and you are doing the right thing at last. You are pursuing your work, you are pursuing your art, and you are becoming the man I always wished you to be. Now, this is a pretty recalcitrant position for a recently deceased wife to take, I guess, but nonetheless, it offers the kind of resigned acceptance of the vicissitudes of life, particularly during a period of wartime, which is inevitably racked by various tragedies, to be plausible. And it enables Mizoguchi to push the film to its very elegiac conclusion, which is to return us to the point where we started, in fact, with the landscape in which this village is set. And it's seen, so suddenly these turbulent human events that we've been following have exactly the status of, for example, the fall of Icarus in a Bruegel painting, where he's a small detail in a much larger landscape that remains indifferent to the fate of this one individual. So the ending of the film reaffirms the social order in a slightly conservative way, it must be said. The characters all accept their roles, the social order is restored, even Miyagi in death accepts her role. And the son is a dutiful filial son praying at his mother's grave. What's missing from this ending is what Mizoguchi brought to the rather similar ending of next year's Sancho the Bailiff, which is the element of enduring tragedy. But nonetheless, these two films, with their serene, transcendent endings, are what define Mizoguchi for world audiences, if not Japanese audiences, for the many decades after his death in which his reputation was secured.